Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. I am again by Right Ruminations to discuss the basis of natural rights thinking. So, why don't you introduce us to this topic?
I want to first contextualize the basis of natural rights thinking in terms of the canon of Western Greco-Roman philosophy. As a lot of people on, say, the dissident right point out, often in a spirit of derision, the natural rights view of the world is a universalistic view. What's meant by natural rights is the idea that there are certain rules that universally govern behavior, and because of these rules, there are certain things that one person cannot do to another person, or that, say, the state can't do to its citizens. And this is natural in addition to being rights-based because it is not just about a particular contract between, say, a particular state and a particular people, but that it has some kind of universal applicability. The reason that this can be understood in conjunction with the earlier Greco-Roman philosophers, even though they were not necessarily natural rights thinkers, in many cases you find severe violations of what might be acceptable natural rights today in, say, Plato or Aristotle. But the Socratic mind, kind of in conjunction, you might say, with the Christian mind, thinks in terms of the truth rather than in terms of, I suppose, appropriate or necessarily virtuous conduct. There is this idea of an overarching Platonic idea of the good. My suspicion, my tendency is to believe that natural rights thinking could not really be possible unless it grew up in this context of a symbiosis between Greco-Roman universalism and Christian universalism. However, it's something that I think the further groundwork is laid for by the scholastics in the medieval period, who don't necessarily start talking in natural rights in the way that Locke did or in the way Rousseau did, but they talk in terms of, you might say, a kind of a prioristic understanding of what the right relationship between the people and the state is. So Aquinas, for example, is the person I have primarily in mind, talked about whether or not it's appropriate for people to depose an unjust king, whether an unjust king even remains a king, whether or not there is a right to a just wage, or whether or not this is something that would be a violation of the rights of employers, and kind of ferreting out or just working out the nuances of questions such as this. Without getting into the particular details of the kind of questions that Aquinas dealt with, the main point that I mean to articulate is that it dealt with the balance between power and the restrictions on power, and therefore, by implication, a kind of proto-rights idea with respect to the citizens living under the state in question. This is something that was further transferred or handed down by the Anglican divine Richard Hooker, which was then taken up by John Locke. At this point, the idea of natural rights becomes a kind of synthesis of this Greco-Roman Christian scholastic formation and the more recent Machiavellian and Hobbesian idea of society as an arrangement in Locke. So this idea that society is kind of an arrangement in Hobbes's mind that's meant to procure a certain outcome, it becomes wedded in Locke as a configuration where the society is this pragmatic arrangement in order to procure this more idealistic and non-pragmatic sense of universally applicable rights. You then moving on from that, with the history of liberalism, have discussions of the distinction between, say, positive and negative rights. For example, are there rights that are guaranteed to the citizens that are, you might say, coercive in nature? Certain things at the modern left, and even certain people on the dissident right, support, like universal health care? Or are there rights that are only expressed in negative terms, which is the direction that libertarians have tended to take it in? I think that sort of, you might say, the most rigorous expression of natural rights thinking, and almost sort of the fourth development, right? If you start with the Greco-Roman tradition, then you introduce Christianity, scholasticism, and then fourthly, the introduction of this social contract idea. I guess maybe it's actually the fifth development, really, is this idea of the non-aggression principle and libertarianism, which, whether you reject it or accept it, I think is the most rigorous iteration of a theory of natural rights thinking so far. This is a kind of map of where I think it started up to where I think it's come.
Well, the idea that there should be a sort of universal moral rule that all people should subscribe to. I mean, obviously, the Abrahamic faiths, have that sort of aspect to it. But to what extent would you say this is similar or dissimilar to perennialism? Because in some ways, perennialism seems to have a similar outlook, that there's this underlying commonality to everything that converges at a point.
I would say that obviously, in the respect that you've raised the comparison, there is some comparison, but then again, it's possible to find similarities in almost any two things you could compare. So I think that it's more of a comparison that I would avoid than one that I would encourage, precisely because perennialism is about the universal applicability of certain kinds of order in society, which are then grounded in regional arrangements. So if you look at the traditionalist school, it is mostly in emphasis, it mostly expresses itself in terms of an expression of the character of certain people. Like if you look at Julius Evola, like he would talk about the distinctions between, say, Aryans and Jews, and he would discuss like various distinctions and obligation on the basis of caste. So I guess the difference is that perennialism, as far as I understand it, is, you might say, universally particularist. So it is universalist in the sense that it's asserting a kind of universal sense of social traditional arrangements, but which are then by nature particular. So in this sense, I think that it's decidedly less universalistic than either the Abrahamic or the natural rights view, in a paradoxical way. Let me see if I can explain this. In a sense, it would be more universalistic than Christianity or natural rights, because it's saying that what matters is not these particular ideas that seem to form in the West, but it's this broader global sense of rootedness in tradition. But at the same time, it's being rooted in expressions of these individual traditions that are confined by things like caste or geography. And in that sense, I suppose, in absolute terms, would be less universalistic and also less theoretical. I think that's another big difference. I think that ideologies that tend to be universalistic, like natural rights thinking, also tend to have some kind of familiarity with the idea of truth as something that's being searched for, and the idea being then that this abstract search of truth in terms of some kind of natural law then transmutes itself into some kind of universally preferable behavior.
Mm-hmm. So from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and when it describes natural law theory, it says, St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, identifies the rational nature of human beings as that which defines moral law. The rule and the measure of human acts is the result, which is the first principle of human acts. On this common view, since human beings are by nature rational beings, it is morally appropriate that they should behave in a way that conforms to their rational nature. Thus, Aquinas derives from this moral law from the nature of human beings, thus the natural law. So what it sounds like here is that Aquinas in this instance is grounding correct human behavior in the context of natural human teleology. So the sort of the lift out of the Greek debates of eudaimonia, what those actions that facilitate human flourishing and are supportive of human flourishing should be encouraged, and those that don't should be discouraged. But what I find interesting is this language. Again, we see this echoed with libertarianism or objectivism. So like, Murray Rothbard and John Locke, and then, Ayn Rand. And yet what I find bizarre is they appropriate the tail of Aquinas's argument, but then they ignore the front half, the half that's teleological. I mean, can you even have a non-teleological natural law in principle?
I think that it is an interesting distinction between the teleological and, you might say, like the deontological expression of natural rights. It is true that, as some paleo-conservatives like Thomas Fleming point out, or as I've heard various Catholic theologians and priests point out, that there is a kind of difference between neo-scholasticism. And for people who maybe would like to learn more about this, you can see our episode on traditionalism versus Thomism, that there is a tension between the kind of natural law or rationalist of scholasticism by the Neo-Thomists in relation to the École de Louvain and to the encyclical, the title of which escapes me, written by Leo XIII, which speaks of Thomism in terms of a kind of a prioristic or rational configuration. That is, it downplays the empirical and, by extension, I suppose, the teleological aspects of Thomism in a way that's actually meant to be a force for conservatism. So obviously Leo XIII is not doing this to, say, uphold any kind of libertarian or Rothbardian views. Quite the opposite. He's doing it to basically put a tighter leash on the convictions or the intellectual disposition. For the objectivists, I think, in a strange way, and then by extension the Rothbardians, because Rand is where Rothbard claimed to get his understanding of natural rights, that they are sort of springboarding off of the Catholic Church's reconfiguration in the 19th century of Thomas as a rational figure, a rationalist figure, which is something that makes it curious that Ayn Rand simultaneously configures herself, presents herself as a rationalist, but also as somebody who, apart from Aristotle, views Aquinas as the only other thinker from which she derived her views. In terms of the contradiction that you might see in whether or not there is an irreconcilable distance between the idea of a natural law and a non-teleological or rationalist disposition, I think I would disagree with you on, or at least on what you're implying, in that I don't really view it as a metaphysical contradiction, because you can still say, even if this is not in line with your views, say politically or theologically, you can still logically say, well, there is a teleology inherent in the relationship between the state and the individual. So just because the individual may have a teleological relationship with whatever behavior he performs, he may have a more limited teleological relationship with the state, in that the state's teleological end might be the enforcement of certain rights that then enable him to either reject or accept his teleological destination, independent of coercion. I don't see anything inherently contradictory in that. All I'll say is it is, as you point out, a departure from the initial sense of the Thomistic configuration.
Well, maybe I misstated maybe I didn't explain it as clearly as I had hoped. What I meant to say is, if reason isn't acting, I mean, what determines the goal reason acts for? Right? If you don't believe in teleology or human nature, then there's really no way in principle to determine in which direction to exercise your reason.
I see what you mean. I mean, it is kind of like atheists arguing for the immorality of Christianity. It's kind of a question of, well, immorality in relation to what morality? I mean, here's the problem. If you're dealing with, say, and I don't want to get too far off topic, but it is true that if you're dealing with somebody like Richard Dawkins, it always becomes very confusing when they say that on the one hand, Christian morality is bunk because what we think is morality is just based on these kind of hardwired biological, by a certain biological condition, and then they say that biology, that these dispositions are therefore are then in turn immoral by some other standard. Well, the question is, by what other external standard? If you've already denied that biology is a basis for moral conduct by essentially saying that our moral prejudices are the basis of ideology and therefore worthless, then by what standard is that itself bad? Is that something like that you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. Or even just the donkey between two hay bales. Why direct one's reason to one hay bale rather than another?
Yeah, I do agree with this, and this is probably a weakness on the part of natural law in general. Before I explain what I mean by that, I do get frustrated by atheistic libertarians insofar as they try to engage in natural rights arguments, precisely because, I mean, natural rights are by their definition a metaphysical conception. And I'm not exactly sure how you can have any kind of metaphysical grounding if you do not have if you don't have, frankly, a kind of reference to something supernatural. This is one of the reasons that I think that you often don't get as frustrated with Thomas Friedman as you do with some other people, because his argument is it is utilitarian and therefore can be justified within an atheistic framework. But if you deal like with Ayn Rand, where she basically admits of metaphysics, but not God, it's almost kind of like having the Platonic forms, but without the Platonic one. It doesn't really make very much sense. But in terms of the tension between between natural rights, I guess, in terms of why would your mind go there logically, why would it lean toward natural rights as opposed to other conclusions, such as, you might say, Aristotle's conception of the good life, right? Why should the state be oriented towards protecting life, liberty, and property, as opposed to maybe indirectly supporting those things as a means to a particular end? And to an extent, I see this as problematic, and this is one of the reasons that I think that philosophy should be more along the lines that David Hume did it, as more of a game, in a sense. You have to be kind of indifferent to the outcome. It's primarily, I think, the best use of philosophy is actually quite useless. But it's useful in a negative sense of basically critiquing other people's sense of confidence and their own big ideas. So I guess it's a deterrent to tyranny in a sense, because it's about critique. And in that sense of philosophy as a kind of game, I think that you're less at risk. If you're just trying to define the limits of human knowledge, what can we really know? If we admit certain axioms, what follow from that? If you play it that way, I think it's less. It's you're less at risk of conjecture or making tenuous connections than if you have a particular outcome or a particular set of values to which your configuration of systematic understanding is oriented. What I would say, if I were to try to defend, because my own belief in natural rights and natural law is sort of in between, it's kind of approximative. What I would say is that I think that there are certain things that are kind of subjectively valuable behaviors, or that I believe in for, say, a theological or a personal or aesthetic reason or whatever. And then I see that empirically and kind of logically that certain systems are by implication the most fit for maintaining a kind of sphere of autonomy within which those actions can be accomplished. And so that there's like a kind of approximation of natural rights that's inherent in the fact that whenever they aren't observed, that they are that life is never able to quite fulfill itself the way it is if we understand a teleological role for the state. So my own view is kind of in between the pragmatic and the natural rights version explanation with respect to this question.
One element that often appears, at least in my observations, trying to create a secular natural rights view for someone like Aristotle or Plato or Aquinas, you can appeal to some transcendental reality, which we can argue whether that properly grounds it, but at least you can make an attempt to ground it. It's difficult to envision how you would ground natural rights or natural law into an atheistic worldview, but there's an evolutionary argument that you'll often hear. You'll hear it from Sam Harris, you'll hear it from the alt-right, you'll hear it from the left, is that, well, we've evolved under a certain set of circumstances, and those behaviors that are conducive for our propagation as a species and are adaptive are to be preferred. Those are the teleological ends, because obviously the Darwinian processes would just wipe us out if we systematically fought against them. But there's a couple of problems with this kind of thinking. The first problem is the famous neo-reactionary timeline: tough times lead to hard men lead to good times lead to bad men, and bad men lead to tough times. To say, because the environment is always changing, so the physical environment and then the human environment is always changing, in some sense, there is no normative form to strive for. So it seems that, right-wing people tend to prefer either the tough times or the beginning of the good times. And so when they say, well, this is abnormal, this is bad, we should, build a man that can survive under those conditions, i.e. the tough times. And whereas, what is stereotypically left-wing tends to prefer the degenerate times, the bad times that were created by bad men. And the thing is, if you want to survive in a, Kafkaesque bureaucratic nightmare, certain traits are going to be selected against. Whereas if you want to survive on a frontier settlement, the traits that kept you alive in the Kafkaesque nightmare will get you killed in the frontier, and vice versa. So the environment itself doesn't really help you solve this problem, because on the one hand, cultures and societies that humans create are always changing. And then also environments are always changing. Even within the past 5,000 years, North Africa used to be a fertile garden that fed the Roman Empire. Now it's a desert. The policies that led to survival, say in the first century AD in North Africa, might not get you so far today with the ever encroaching Sahara Desert nipping at your heels. And so, what's conducive for optimal survival? Well, in what context? And that's never spelled out. That's always left vague and nebulous, left for the reader to interpret himself, which fundamentally leads this to be the only way you could, if I'm going to be generous, the only way you could say this would work is if you said you're basically taking into account all possible contingencies and just trying to be the most resilient individual, full stop. And of course, you can't take care of all contingencies, but nobody even does that.
I think that with respect to the people that you're talking about, they're also very inconsistent with it. So if you say that it's preferable teleologically because that was what people evolved for, which is dubious in any case, because I mean, in that case, you wouldn't be talking about something, you could not possibly be talking about something that's morally preferable. It would be still purely pragmatic because you're talking in reference to survival. But I mean, the thing is that if you say to Richard Dawkins, this is something that really happened. Somebody said to Richard Dawkins, well, what if there is a genetic evolutionary basis for religion? Why should we not be religious? And he said, well, his answer, as I understand it, was essentially, well, this shouldn't matter because we know that this basically just comes from genetics. So what do you care? But at the same time, if you were to say, well, why should you not murder someone? For some reason, his disposition would change. I actually remember somebody who was on the alt-right talking about Dawkins with respect to basically, I think it was with respect to the question of why it is okay, why it is not okay to say kill a fish, and Dawkins' position was that it was speciesist to say that you can't want to kill the unborn fetus, but you can want to kill the fish since they have maybe about roughly the same level of, say, consciousness. But then, for some reason, racism is bad. I have no idea why one has a moral reference and the other doesn't. And I would also say that in case someone is maybe disposed to bring up the kind of Comtean arrangement, where you start with the religious phase and you move into the metaphysical phase, and then you finally move into the rational phase, that it is, or the scientific paradigm. I think the problem is that it overlooks the fact that that the actual disposition toward religion does not really change. It simply gets replaced by some other iteration of religion that is simply claiming to be non-religious. I mean, if you just look at how people talk about any of the prevailing ideologies we see today, I mean, what you were implying is kind of open-ended, rational framework, then clearly Comte's scientific phase has not really resulted in that. Though, unlike Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris, Comte never pretended it would be. He basically came out and said, yes, I support a kind of authoritarian version of the medieval church, only it will be in the name of science. With respect to natural rights thinking, I mean, my way of looking at it, to kind of bring this full circle, is that whether you're dealing with theocratic tyranny or authoritarianism, let's say, or whether you're dealing with scientific authoritarianism, or whether you are dealing with metaphysical authoritarianism, I do think that some kind of natural rights thinking is, in a modest sense, necessary to keep those forces at bay. So you might say that because man is, it's one thing to say that man is naturally religious, but it's another thing to say that man is naturally theocratic. And I think that kind of part of the problem from like the secularist point of view is that man actually is naturally theocratic. And it's one of the reasons that it's difficult to maintain an individualistic society, because people will then come to look on things like whether it's political correctness or science or what have you as a kind of substitute religion, even if that's not how some people intend it to be. That's usually the way that it ends up being. And so I think that in order to almost safeguard against the sort of the sort of biological or anthropological disposition to have a theocratic society, you need some kind of arrangement. You need some kind of understanding of maybe not a social contract in the kind of overly intellectualized sense that Locke understood it, but you need some kind of modest sense of one to understand that here's the deal. You have this power, and we are letting you have this power in exchange for it not being used more than the kind of the two of us together decide it should be used. And so I think that there is a kind of marriage that's possible between a pragmatic outlook and a natural rights outlook. That being said, I think that the natural rights grow best in the soil of some kind of culture that was at least one time Christian. Like, I don't think a natural rights society would have grown up in something like a Hindu society, or if you had, say, a society that had just been run by Dawkins atheists for since time began, and that was their religion. I don't really see them developing any kind of sense of natural rights in any systematically meaningful sense with relation to the power of the state. So I do see a kind of necessity of some kind of spiritual sensibility for rights for any kind of taking seriously of natural rights to occur.
I would agree. I don't think rights, especially as we see them in the West, could have developed in a vacuum. I think the other attempted solution to this problem of where to ground or direct, these natural rights is obviously Ayn Rand. She says man's essential characteristic is his rational faculty. Man's mind is the basic means of survival, his means of gaining knowledge. So the classic objectivist argument goes, well, we need to survive, so we need to use our reason to produce things that we can use to survive, and if we don't own them and people can just take them away, then none of us would survive. And so that is sort of echoing that evolutionary argument. But one of the problems with this is a lot of rights, natural rights language from objectivists and libertarians who sound like that, is they'll then attack any sort of legislation or office or institution that is reliant upon positive rights. So they'll say, the right to property, the right to free speech, the right to association, all those are rights, but the right to food, education, clothes, or shelter are not rights. But if reason is the means by which man survives and the means by which man is able to keep off the chaotic forces of nature at bay, and then you just sort of let, at the very earliest stages of human existence, they don't get food, clothes, and shelter, then you literally are undercutting the very principle for which you're deriving your rights in the first place.
Well, first of all, I'll say something to build on what you're saying, and then I'll push back just in way of playing devil's advocate with respect to what you've said about the objectivists. So, first of all, I agree that they are playing a kind of word game when it comes to their logic. Just focus on the objectivists for a moment. Because if you look at John Galt's speech, his 60-page or however long speech in Atlas Shrugged, there is this sort of argument, which is like an ultra-rigorous version of Locke's argument on some level. And it is, like you say, that reason is the basis of survival. And therefore, relationship with other men must be non-coercive. Because then they if it isn't, then there will be some external force operating against their use of their reason, and they will therefore that will therefore be at cross purposes with the basic mechanism by which they survive. But this is a problem because it looks at the mind as this purely unitary thing, almost as an assumption. It looks like it's saying, well, because one aspect of man's survival relies on his individual use of reason, let's say like the reason that he uses to create a fire in order to cook food. And then he needs that to survive, or to hunt, or what have you, or to build a bed. This is therefore something that, because he has to be allowed to do that, it needs to be something that he is allowed to do. If he's not allowed to use his reason in that way, and if he's not allowed to have property with which to act on his reason, then he will not be able to survive. And the extent to which his reason is hindered, and his ability to act on his reason by use of his property and his physical person is inhibited, then he will, in proportion to that, be less able to survive. But what this doesn't take into account is that just because there's some aspects of human life that are like that, that does not mean that all aspects of human life are like that. Maybe there are other aspects of human survival that rely on him not using his reason. I mean, if to use just logically a hypothetical example, let's say that every time he fails to have a theocratic disposition, then the society becomes coercive. Somewhat hypothetical, but not logically impossible. Imagine if you could create this non-coercive society, and then as soon as people failed to be irrationally religious, then the society would become coercive. Well, then you'd have a contradiction. So why is it that man's survival couldn't depend on reason in some circumstances without depending on reason in all other circumstances? And of course, the answer that the objectivists will give is then an empirical answer. But and they may be correct, maybe their position is correct, but once you've ventured into the realm of then importing and saying, well, the market actually doesn't work like that, it works this way, and we can see that this is actually what happens, then you've kind of ventured outside of the question of natural rights, and you've started to deal with things in terms of how they actually work in practice, which maybe they do, but that's no longer really an argument from natural rights in the kind of systematic and absolute rational sense in which they present it. But with respect to your argument against them, my counter argument would be the one that libertarians like Tom Woods, for example, make. They would say, well, the reason that you need that this is not really a contradiction with this natural rights configuration is because you have an obligation to take care of a child that you brought into the world with these things, because you are the one who put them in that situation. So because you put them in that situation, it would be an indirect act of coercion to not supply them with the things that they need to survive and eventually come to exercise their reason. It's almost like inviting somebody into your house and then saying, oh, by the way, I'm fumigating right now, and you have to stay in here anyway. Well, any libertarian would consider that an act of aggression. So to not raise your child properly could be seen as kind of a breach of trusteeship.
It could be, and I usually say this argument from Christian libertarians, but it still needs to be pointed out this is a highly contentious position, and Rothbard and Bloch both agree that the parent is under no obligation to feed, clothe, or take care of the child in any way. Which, if that's the case, then it completely undercuts the entire logic of the argument. And the other point that I'm making is not that you couldn't make pragmatic arguments extrinsic to rights theory, but merely if you follow the theory to its logical conclusion, you're going to have to end up with positive rights. Now, you may not like that, but you can't put, it's the taxi cab fallacy to follow the theory only part way and then get off the bus when you don't like where it's going. I mean, yeah, you might have independent reasons, but then they never actually tell you what these independent reasons are. They all tend to be very shadowy, very vague, and it's not entirely clear where these limiting factors are coming from.
Well, what I would say, another thing about the objectivists, of course, is that if so long as we're talking about this idea of using your reason as something that's necessary for your survival, I mean, one of the great ironies of this is, of course, is that the objectivists have shown themselves empirically, if you will, to be in no way tolerant of people using their reason independent of the conclusions that they, the objectivists, have drawn. So even though they might not be in like absolute contradiction because they're not advocating silencing people with the state, socially speaking, and in terms, and you might say culturally speaking, I mean, the objectivists are just thoroughgoing authoritarians. I mean, Ayn Rand had basically an index of forbidden books. So, you know, I would say that almost in charity to other to libertarians, properly speaking, that some distance maybe should be put between them and the objectivists, just because the objectivists are so narrow-minded and contradictory, and, you know, they're basically like, what they are, the way I look at objectivists, they're like a libertarian version of Marxists mixed with the Society of St. Pius X.
Wow. I think that's a fair point. I mean, Ayn Rand herself, you know, strongly distanced herself from the libertarian movement as a whole. But I think this is where my criticism kind of gets zeroed in on. In the 2009 article, Ed Feser wrote this in a criticism of Rothbard as a philosopher. Rothbard said that, you know, we need these rights. We have these rights because we need them to survive. And these are much the same rights that Ayn Rand talks about. You know, right to self-ownership, right to owning what you produce, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, all those things. But then Feser says, after all, the fact that you need something doesn't entail that you have it. And as libertarians themselves never tire of pointing out, it certainly doesn't entail that you have a right to it. Exactly. So just because you need property and to use your reason to live doesn't entail that you have a right to it. In the very same reason that if you need food, clothes, and shelter, it doesn't entail you have a right to it. And if you can demonstrate a right to the former, I don't see how you can deny a right to the latter.
Yes, I think that it might be a language issue in that, I mean, I agree, by the way, with what I think you're driving towards, which is that they don't really have the kind of infallible epistemic basis for their configuration of natural rights that they pretend to. But I do wonder if I have the kind of instinct that there might be a way of making the distinction such as to avoid the contradiction for the libertarians. And if I were a libertarian, what would I say? I think I would say that the difference is that if you are saying that somebody's entitled to something because that's how they live, that's what they need to survive, like materially speaking, that's different than saying that what they need to live, that this is what they need to live in terms of this is how humans survive. So in other words, one is trying to preserve a kind of mechanistic account of how humans have to operate in order to provide for their survival in a way that's not at cross purposes with their needs. And the other one is just kind of looking at particular objects and saying, well, they need this and they need that. So I think that the best defense of the libertarians in this case would be for them to say that that the difference is that we are talking about the need to a certain mode of survival that's proper to the species, whereas Feser is kind of implying a support for like a right to particular things without it being in reference to an overarching mechanism.
Yeah, but I think the other aspect that I was getting at here is that while certainly with the American conservative movement, which we talked about briefly last week, and then also libertarian and objectivist thought, there's this idea that, you know, that they own the natural rights, you know, package. And to some extent, they've provided the most sophisticated defense for it. That's true. But a lot of left-wing arguments for the abolition of want. Everybody has food, education, clothing, and shelter. They can make a fairly plausible argument from a purely rights theory that you do need those things. And then if that's the case, if both the libertarian right and the collectivist left can make these claims both from a rights basis, how is it solving any of our problems?
Yeah, I think that what I'd say in favor of the libertarians is that maybe they are the most coherent of all political theorists who want to provide a kind of universalistic account of natural rights. But as we've talked about in, say, our video about the limits of human knowledge, coherence does not equal demonstration. It's quite simple. I think that's almost a kind of maybe fallacy that should be formulated if it hasn't been already, that basically there's a kind of argument from coherence that because what I'm saying is coherent and well systematized, that it therefore must be true. Now, it is true that if you're dealing with, say, left libertarians who have a kind of inability, in my thinking, to systemize this seriously, and that they do tend to, like, if you look at like the kind of like left-wing anarchism of Noam Chomsky, well, I tend to find that to be a lot less coherent than what I hear from, say, Hans Hermann Hoppe or Walter Block. Like, I think it is more like difficult to iron out a lot of the time, even what he's talking about. But at the same time, in a sense, there's more trickery going on in the right libertarians, precisely because they are hiding behind coherence. Let me try to run by you. One more thing that I'll say about that before going on about this argument from coherence is that the thought has passed my mind. I'll just go on to what I was going to say. The argument that I would make for a kind of natural rights is to first, as I've said before, assume that I do not have powers of coercive demonstration, that anything that I'm going to prove rests on assumptions. It rests on certain axioms that I basically take subjectively. They're basically their first principles. And that would be certain things about what makes life worth living. And I would say that things like contemplation, pursuit of truth, the ability to not live in fear, and the ability to have some kind of objective system of rules in which one's conflict can be in reference in terms of one's relationship to authority. That is, some kind of contractual arrangement is necessary tangentially to ensure that these kind of personalistic first principles are protected. So if you look then empirically at, well, what are the circumstances in which a kind of contemplative individualism can come to exist? It tends to have to be some kind of society that does have, let's say, a facsimile of non-aggression, at least in having like free market capitalism, because that kind of existence doesn't really exist en masse except for people who are well-to-do, that there has to be a material basis for it, as well as like widespread existence of intellectual material, which also tends to be facilitated by some kind of market system. And that also there has to be an understanding of contractual limits on what state power can do. And if there isn't, for example, freedom of speech, or if there is not some kind of constitutional rule, then there can be no steady, reliable, or predictable basis on which man can be in possession of that which I believe is his actual natural right, which is basically the right to the highest end, which is the pursuit of truth and contemplation in circumstances where not every moment is living terror. And so I think that this is almost like a kind of synthesis of like pragmatic arguments and natural rights argument, where the natural law with respect to rights kind of emerges as like an approximation of a set of rights without it being necessarily rights that are derived from like a mathematical syllogism. What do you think of that configuration?
Well, what I think is that this is what most people don't do. You clearly stated your assumptions at the beginning of the argument, which ceteris paribus is always better. So that's on a firmer footing to start with. And then the second question is, if the good that you derive from your axioms is such, whatever that happens to be, do the material conditions and cultural conditions you advocate, are they consistent with the goods that you derive from your axioms? I would say that, at least in the case of how you spelled it out, they are. I mean, you need leisure to do philosophy, as Aristotle said. And I guess one could argue, for better or for worse, the United States is one of the most leisured countries in human history. They just didn't decide to do philosophy.
Yes, and if that other thing that I had that escaped me, it may come up later. I can't recall it right now.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing with the rights, I guess we should end with Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. I think in some sense, sort of right. See, this is the whole problem itself, right? Natural rights by nature, as you mentioned earlier in this discussion, are transcendental qualities. And so if you ground them in a transcendental origin, whether it's the unity of the forms or the prime mover or the Christian God or the Jewish God, as Maimonides, Aquinas, Plato, and Aristotle all did, at least to follow the Aristotelian norm, the effect is consistent with the cause. The cause is sufficient to explain the effect because both are transcendental. If you're a materialist, then you have a material cause producing a transcendental effect. And that's very difficult, if not impossible, to solve, because I haven't seen anyone solve that problem. So I think on the surface of it, it's more consistent because the cause and effect are of the same nature, the same kind. So there's that. I think if the agent is not a rational agent, like the Abrahamic religions indicate, I think it's a bit difficult to figure out where rules, duties, and obligations come from, because if it's like just the one, this platonic one, which doesn't really have a persona and permeates all of reality, it's a law is an imperative, a right is something that was granted. Imperatives and grants are the product of a mind, and so I think the theist, the Christian Jewish theists and Islamic theists who make this claim are on firmer ground than say Aristotle and Plato, because it's difficult to envision how I don't want to say irrational, but maybe non-rational or non-agent can come up with effects that are only the effects of other agents.
Well, I think that the configuration that I've outlined as my own argument for kind of natural rights would actually be much more defensible from an atheistic point of view. And it's funny that with so many of these libertarians, and even with so many of the skeptic types, including the ones on the left, there is this kind of importation of metaphysical morals, whereas the kind of irony is that myself, as being a theist, I am actually the one who's introduced a system that is less dependent on theistic presuppositions, in that with them, they are saying that there are certain things that kind of are independent of what you want or of what is pleasant to you, that are nevertheless necessary because some kind of primal concept which has virtually no relation to the process of evolution and is essentially a kind of ad hoc importation. Whereas with the argument that I've outlined for natural rights, basically I'm just being honest about, well, what do I want? What do I really value? And then how do I argue for facilitating that without actively contradicting myself?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we could argue that a large part of the confusion is a confusion of method. If we all had a consistent, straightforward method, this would be less difficult. But now that we're nearing the end of the hour, what would your final thoughts be on this?
My final thoughts would be that even though Thomas Aquinas is often looked a figure of authoritarianism, frankly, by Catholics who want to pursue like an ultramontane or a rigorist agenda, that he basically only appears to be authoritarian because conservative Catholics tend to appropriate him now, and because he was just expressing a defense of the authoritarian political arrangements of his society. But if you look at it, it was the introduction of Aquinas into Christian thought, which was then taken up by Hooker, and then through Locke was transmitted to modern libertarianism. I actually think that there's much more truth to the kind of libertarian claim of Aquinas as an antecedent to their thinking, but not really for the reasons that they say. They'll point to weird things like his economics or something like that don't really have that much to do with them. But that if you just look at the kind of methodology he was employing, basically by talking about natural law, there was by implication, I suppose, a corollary of that of natural right, and that that the Greco-Roman tradition, the scholastic tradition, the Abrahamic tradition, as well as contract theory, all come down to a point of people with some presupposition of systematizable natural rights, which even if just, I think can often be presumptuous because they will then engineer philosophical syllogisms in that direction, even if they are atheists and therefore not in keeping with the kind of intelligence-based theological bent that originally lent itself to natural rights thinking. And that furthermore, I think that if atheists were to use approximative arguments like the ones that I've made, then they might, for the first time, actually be able to work out something like a non-theistic morality, if simply from the basis of consistency in reference to an honesty about what one actually experiences being most essential. I guess my final point would be is that I'm kind of astounded and think it says a lot about atheists that they haven't configured arguments like this. And to be honest, I think that the reason that they haven't is because they want to hold on to, as odd as it sounds, the moralistic excesses of Christianity. That is what Nietzsche saw as Christianism. I think that the atheists want to maintain that with respect to their own pet preferences with respect to political correctness. And so that makes their arguments inherently contentious because they're essentially trying to maintain a theistic moral framework within a materialistic metaphysical framework, which is troublingly inconsistent. Perhaps if they had more of the Christian virtue of humility, then they would be able to become better at supporting their arguments in line and consistently with their atheist presuppositions.
So my final thoughts are David Friedman for the win. This is